If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing it with your friends and family helps spread knowledge. And when we help others grow, we grow too. Thank you so much for listening. Let's dive into the podcast. Chapter 1, The Prelude to a Tragedy. Part 1, A Nation on the Brink. America in early 1963 stood at a crossroads between hope and fear. The nation buzzed with excitement about the space program, watching as astronauts pushed closer to the moon with each mission. President Kennedy's bold promise to land on the lunar surface before the decade's end captured imaginations across the country. Children played astronaut in backyards, while families gathered around television sets to witness rocket launches that seemed to prove America could achieve anything. Yet beneath this optimism ran deep currents of anxiety. The Cold War cast a shadow over daily life, with nuclear war feeling like a real possibility. Families built bomb shelters in their basements, and schools held duck and cover drills. The Cuban Missile Crisis had brought the world to the brink just months earlier, leaving many Americans jumpy about what might come next. Every news bulletin carried the potential for catastrophe. The civil rights movement added another layer of tension to the national mood. Television screens showed peaceful protesters being attacked with fire hoses and police dogs in Birmingham. The sight of children being arrested for demanding basic rights shook many Americans to their core. Others grew angry at the challenges to traditional ways of life. Communities found themselves split between those demanding change and those resisting it. President Kennedy walked a tightrope through these competing forces. His youth and charisma had inspired millions during his campaign, creating expectations that sometimes seemed impossible to meet. He spoke eloquently about civil rights while trying not to lose Southern support. He projected strength against communist threats while working behind the scenes to avoid nuclear conflict. The space race became a symbol of everything America wanted to prove about itself. Each Soviet achievement in space felt like a personal defeat to many Americans. When Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, it stung national pride. Kennedy's moon pledge transformed scientific exploration into a matter of national honor. Economic prosperity helped balance some of the anxiety. Jobs were plentiful, and the middle class was growing. Suburbs expanded as young families bought homes with modern conveniences their parents could never have imagined. This material progress created confidence that America was moving in the right direction, even as global events remained troubling. The president himself seemed to embody both the promise and the pressure of the times. His beautiful wife and young children made the White House feel alive in ways Americans had never experienced. Yet the weight of nuclear responsibility and domestic challenges aged him visibly. Those close to him noticed the strain of carrying the hopes of an entire nation. Political observers sensed that 1963 would be crucial for Kennedy's presidency. His handling of domestic and international crises would determine whether Americans continued to see him as the leader they needed for turbulent times. The stakes could not have been higher, as the nation watched and waited to see which direction their young president would take them. Part 2. Kennedy's Texas Visit. Kennedy knew Texas would make or break his chances in 1964. The massive state held 25 electoral votes, and without them, winning a second term would prove nearly impossible. But Texas presented a political puzzle that even the most skilled politicians found difficult to solve. The Democratic Party in Texas had split into bitter factions. Conservative Democrats, led by Governor John Connally, represented the old guard of Southern politics. They supported Kennedy, but with clear reservations about his civil rights positions and liberal policies. On the other side, liberal Democrats, like Senator Ralph Yarborough, pushed for faster progress on social issues and criticized what they saw as Kennedy's cautious approach. This division created daily headaches for Kennedy's political team. The two camps barely spoke to each other, and their public feuding made national headlines. Vice President Lyndon Johnson, himself a Texan, found himself caught in the middle, trying to bridge gaps that seemed to widen by the day. Kennedy needed both sides united behind him, but achieving that unity seemed almost impossible. The conservative opposition ran deeper than party politics. Wealthy oil executives and business leaders saw Kennedy as a threat to their interests. His policies on oil depletion allowances and corporate taxes had cost them millions. Some spoke openly about finding ways to defeat him, while others whispered about more drastic measures. Right-wing groups distributed flyers calling Kennedy a traitor and communist sympathizer. Dallas presented particular challenges. The city's political climate had grown increasingly hostile toward Kennedy and federal authority. Adlai Stevenson, the former presidential candidate, had been attacked and spat upon during a recent visit to Dallas. The incident shocked national observers and raised serious questions about Kennedy's safety in the city. Kennedy's advance team worked frantically to ensure smooth events across Texas. They planned stops in San Antonio, Houston, Fort Worth, and Dallas, hoping to showcase the president to as many voters as possible. Each appearance required careful coordination with local officials, many of whom harbored their own political grudges. The president understood the risks, but felt he had no choice. Texas represented more than electoral votes. It symbolized his ability to heal divisions within his own party. Success here could demonstrate his political skills and strengthen his position heading into the election year. Political allies warned Kennedy about the intensity of opposition he might face. Some suggested avoiding Dallas altogether, given the city's reputation for political extremism. Others argued that backing down would show weakness and encourage further hostility. Kennedy chose to proceed with the full schedule. He believed that facing opposition directly, rather than avoiding it, would ultimately serve him better. The stakes were clear: unite Texas Democrats, win back skeptical voters, and prove that he could handle the political challenges of a presidential campaign. As November approached, both opportunity and danger awaited the president in Texas. Part 3: Warnings and Unease. The warnings began weeks before Kennedy ever set foot in Texas. Intelligence reports filtered into the Secret Service about the hostile climate waiting for the president. Dallas had earned a reputation as a city where political tensions ran dangerously high. Just 1 month earlier, United Nations Ambassador Adlai Stevenson had visited Dallas and faced an angry mob that spat on him and struck him with protest signs. The incident shocked many Americans, but it served as a clear warning of what Kennedy might encounter. Local newspapers published harsh editorials attacking the president's policies. Radio stations broadcast daily criticism of Kennedy's civil rights stance and foreign policy decisions. The atmosphere grew so heated that some Democratic leaders in Texas privately urged Kennedy to reconsider visiting Dallas altogether. Senator William Fulbright told Kennedy directly that going to Texas felt dangerous, especially to Dallas, where hatred for the president seemed to burn brightest. The president himself seemed unusually aware of the risks. During a private conversation with his wife Jackie, Kennedy mentioned that if someone wanted to shoot a president, they could easily do it from a high building with a rifle. His words proved chillingly prophetic. Yet publicly, Kennedy maintained his determination to complete the Texas trip. He refused to let fear dictate his schedule or limit his contact with the American people. Secret Service agents received specific threats against Kennedy's life during the Texas visit. Anonymous phone calls warned that the president would not leave Dallas alive. Letters arrived containing death threats and detailed plans for violence. The FBI had identified several individuals in the Dallas area who posed potential dangers to the president. Despite these warnings, security preparations remained largely routine, following standard protocols rather than implementing extraordinary measures. Local political figures contributed to the charged atmosphere. Conservative groups placed inflammatory advertisements in Dallas newspapers the morning of Kennedy's arrival, accusing him of treason and communist sympathies. Handbills circulated throughout the city showing Kennedy's photograph alongside the word "wanted" in bold letters, designed to look like an FBI wanted poster. These materials created an environment where political opposition crossed into dangerous territory. The mood among Kennedy's advisors grew increasingly tense as reports continued flowing in about Dallas hostility. Some suggested changing the motorcade route or reducing the president's public appearances. Others recommended increasing security measures or bringing additional agents. However, Kennedy insisted on maintaining the planned schedule, believing that backing down would send the wrong message to both supporters and opponents. Weather forecasts threatened to complicate matters further. Rain seemed likely, which would require the presidential limousine's protective top to be raised, limiting visibility and crowd interaction. Kennedy hoped for clear skies, wanting to connect directly with Texas voters. The irony was stark. The president desired maximum exposure to win political support, while that same exposure created maximum vulnerability to those who wished him harm. As November 22nd approached, the warnings and unease had created a perfect storm of known dangers and ignored signals, setting the stage for tragedy in Dallas. Part 4. Lee Harvey Oswald's Shadow. As warnings and fears circulated through Dallas, another story was taking shape in the shadows. Miles away from the political calculations and security preparations, a troubled young man named Lee Harvey Oswald was living quietly with his wife Marina in a modest duplex in Irving, Texas. Few could have imagined that this unremarkable 24-year-old would soon alter the course of American history. Oswald's path to that November morning had been anything but ordinary. Born in New Orleans in 1939, he grew up without a father and with a mother who struggled to provide stability. As a teenager, he showed early signs of the restlessness and anger that would define his adult life. He dropped out of high school and joined the Marines at 17, seeking structure and purpose that had been missing from his chaotic childhood. The Marines should have straightened him out, but Oswald proved to be a difficult soldier. He clashed with authority, received multiple reprimands, and spent time in the brig for insubordination. Despite these troubles, he learned to shoot. His marksmanship scores were decent, though not exceptional. More troubling was his growing fascination with communist ideology. While stationed in Japan, Oswald taught himself Russian and began reading Marxist literature, setting himself apart from his fellow servicemen. In 1959, shortly after his discharge, Oswald made a shocking decision that would define the next phase of his life. He traveled to Moscow and attempted to defect to the Soviet Union. At the American embassy, he dramatically declared his intention to renounce his citizenship and hand over military secrets. Soviet officials, however, were suspicious of this young American who seemed too eager to abandon his homeland. They initially rejected his request for permanent residence. Oswald's desperation became clear when he attempted suicide in his Moscow hotel room after learning of the rejection. This dramatic gesture, whether genuine or calculated, convinced Soviet authorities to reconsider. They allowed him to stay and eventually sent him to work in a radio factory in Minsk, a provincial city far from the political centers of power. Life in the Soviet Union quickly lost its romantic appeal for Oswald. The reality of communist society proved far different from the idealized version he had imagined. He found the work boring, the bureaucracy stifling, and his fellow workers indifferent to his presence. His diary from this period reveals growing disillusionment and loneliness. The great revolutionary cause he thought he was joining turned out to be mundane and disappointing. During his time in Minsk, Oswald met and married Marina Prusakova, a young pharmacy student. Their relationship was passionate but turbulent, marked by Oswald's volatile temper and controlling behavior. When their daughter was born, Oswald began to reconsider his future. The Soviet Union was not the promised land he had expected, and he started to feel trapped in his new life. By 1962, Oswald was actively seeking to return to America. The same embassy where he had once renounced his citizenship now processed his request to come home. The American government, perhaps surprisingly, was willing to help. Cold War tensions made defectors valuable sources of intelligence, and Oswald's return was quietly arranged. Back in America, with his Russian wife and infant daughter, Oswald struggled to find his place. He moved frequently, worked various low-paying jobs, and grew increasingly frustrated with his circumstances. His marriage to Marina became more strained as cultural differences and his violent temper created constant tension. Neighbors and co-workers remembered him as quiet but argumentative, intelligent but bitter. In the months leading up to November 1963, Oswald's behavior became more erratic. He ordered weapons through the mail, including the rifle that would soon become infamous. He involved himself in pro-Castro political activities, even though his commitment to any cause seemed shallow and self-serving. His attempts to travel to Cuba were rejected, leaving him feeling more isolated and angry than ever. The man who would soon change history remained largely invisible to those around him. His co-workers at the Texas School Book Depository knew him as a quiet employee who kept to himself. Marina saw him as an increasingly unstable husband whose dreams had curdled into resentment. Neither the American government nor Soviet intelligence agencies considered him particularly important or dangerous. As President Kennedy's motorcade route was finalized and security preparations continued, Oswald was simply another anonymous face in Dallas. The convergence of the president's visit and the assassin's presence was taking shape, though no one yet understood the terrible significance of their intersection. Part 5. The day begins. The morning of November 22, 1963, dawned bright and clear in Fort Worth, Texas. President Kennedy woke up in his suite at the Hotel Texas, looking forward to what promised to be a successful day of political fence-mending. Jackie Kennedy, elegant in her pink Chanel suit, prepared for what she knew would be a demanding schedule of public appearances. The president seemed relaxed at breakfast, joking with local Democratic leaders about the weather and the warm reception they had received the night before. Across the state in Dallas, the city buzzed with anticipation. Despite the political tensions that had marked Kennedy's visit to Texas, thousands of residents planned to line the streets for a glimpse of their president. Local newspapers had published the motorcade route, and downtown workers made plans to step outside their offices during their lunch breaks. The Dallas Police Department had been preparing for weeks, coordinating security measures with the Secret Service. At Love Field Airport, ground crews readied Air Force One for the short flight from Fort Worth. The president's advance team had spent days fine-tuning every detail of the Dallas visit. The motorcade route had been carefully planned to maximize public exposure while allowing Kennedy to reach the Trade Mart in time for his scheduled luncheon speech. The open-top limousine had been specifically requested to allow crowds better views of the president and First Lady. Secret Service agents conducted their final briefings, reviewing the 11-mile route through downtown Dallas. They noted the tall buildings along the path, but felt confident in their standard security protocols. Local police officers received their assignments for crowd control and traffic management. The Dallas Morning News had run a hostile full-page advertisement that morning, but law enforcement officials saw no immediate threats requiring special attention. At the Texas School Book Depository, employees arrived for another ordinary Friday. Lee Harvey Oswald clocked in as usual, carrying a long package he claimed contained curtain rods for his apartment. His supervisor noticed nothing unusual about his demeanor. The building overlooked Dealey Plaza, where the presidential motorcade would make a sharp turn before heading toward the freeway. By mid-morning, excitement was building throughout Dallas. School children lined up along the route, waving small American flags. Office workers claimed spots at windows overlooking the street. Television crews set up their equipment to capture the president's arrival. The atmosphere felt festive, almost carnival-like, as the city prepared to welcome its most famous visitor. As Air Force One taxied down the runway in Fort Worth, bound for Dallas, the final pieces of this fateful day were falling into place. The president reviewed his trademark speech one last time, unaware that less than 2 hours later, those words would never be spoken. The machinery of this carefully orchestrated visit was now in motion, carrying everyone involved toward an appointment with history that none of them could have imagined when they woke that morning. Chapter 2. The Assassination in Dealey Plaza. Part 1. the motorcade through Dallas. The presidential motorcade wound its way through the streets of Dallas on November 22, 1963, carrying with it the hopes and excitement of thousands who had gathered to see their young president. The sun shone brightly over Dealey Plaza as crowds lined the streets, waving flags and cheering enthusiastically. Children perched on their parents' shoulders, office workers leaned out of windows, and elderly citizens stood proudly along the curbs, all eager to catch a glimpse of John F. Kennedy and his elegant wife Jackie. The motorcade itself was a carefully arranged procession of vehicles designed to showcase the president while maintaining security. The lead car carried Dallas police officers and Secret Service agents who scanned the crowd for any signs of trouble. Behind them, President Kennedy and First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy rode in an open-top Lincoln Continental, its dark blue exterior gleaming in the midday sun. The president sat on the right side of the back seat, Jackie beside him in her distinctive pink Chanel suit and matching pillbox hat. Governor John Connally of Texas occupied the jump seat directly in front of Kennedy, with his wife Nellie beside him. The decision to keep the car's convertible top down, despite security concerns, reflected the president's desire to connect with the people. Kennedy had always believed that a president should be seen and accessible, even when advisors worried about potential dangers. The Secret Service follow-up car trailed closely behind, packed with agents ready to respond to any threat. Yet even with these precautions, gaps existed in the security arrangements. The route had been published in local newspapers days earlier, giving anyone with ill intent ample time to plan. Buildings along the parade route had not been thoroughly secured, and many windows remained unchecked. As the motorcade turned from Houston Street onto Elm Street, entering Dealey Plaza proper, the crowds continued their enthusiastic welcome. Mrs. Connally turned to President Kennedy with a smile, saying, "Mr. President, you can't say Dallas doesn't love you." Kennedy smiled back, clearly pleased by the warm reception from a city that had been considered politically hostile territory. The Texas School Book Depository loomed above the plaza, its red brick facade housing workers who had paused their duties to watch the presidential procession below. On the 6th floor, boxes of textbooks were stacked near the windows, creating shadows in the sunlit rooms. The building seemed as ordinary and peaceful as the rest of the scene unfolding in the plaza. Nobody in the cheering crowds could have imagined that within moments, this joyous celebration would transform into one of the darkest days in American history. The motorcade continued its slow progress through the plaza, the president and first lady waving to their admirers, completely unaware that their lives were about to change forever. Part 2. The shots ring out. At exactly 12:30 p.m., the tranquil scene in Dealey Plaza shattered in an instant. 3 sharp cracks echoed across the open space, cutting through the cheers and applause like thunder on a clear day. The sounds came from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, where a lone gunman had positioned himself behind stacked boxes of textbooks. The first shot missed its target completely, striking the pavement near the presidential limousine. Many people in the crowd thought they heard a firecracker or a motorcycle backfiring. President Kennedy continued waving, his broad smile unchanged. The cheering crowd kept applauding, unaware that death had just whistled past their beloved leader. The second shot found its mark with devastating precision. The bullet struck President Kennedy in the back of his neck, exiting through his throat. The impact caused him to clutch at his neck with both hands, his face suddenly contorting in pain and confusion. Jackie Kennedy, sitting beside him in her pink suit, turned toward her husband with growing alarm. She could see something was terribly wrong. This same bullet continued its deadly path, striking Texas Governor John Connally, who sat in the jump seat directly in front of the president. The projectile tore through Connally's back, chest, wrist, and thigh in a matter of milliseconds. The governor cried out in agony, doubling over as blood began to stain his white shirt. The third and final shot came just seconds later, delivering the fatal blow. The bullet struck President Kennedy in the head with explosive force. The impact was so violent that it threw him backward against the rear seat of the limousine. Jackie Kennedy, in a moment of pure instinct and terror, began climbing onto the trunk of the moving car, reaching for pieces of her husband's skull and brain matter. Secret Service agent Clint Hill, running alongside the limousine, leaped onto the back of the car. He pushed Mrs. Kennedy back into her seat and shielded the presidential couple with his own body. His face was a mask of horror as he realized the extent of the president's injuries. Blood and brain matter covered the interior of the car, the seats, and Jackie's pink suit. The crowd's joyful cheers transformed into screams of terror and confusion. Some people dropped to the ground, thinking more shots might follow. Others stood frozen in disbelief, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Parents grabbed their children and ran for cover behind the concrete structures in the plaza. Driver Roy Kellerman shouted into his radio, his voice breaking with urgency. Agent Hill pounded on the trunk of the limousine, screaming for the driver to get them to the hospital immediately. The presidential limousine accelerated rapidly, racing away from Dealey Plaza toward Parkland Hospital, leaving behind a scene of chaos and a nation about to be forever changed. Part 3: Chaos and Reaction. The presidential limousine sped through the streets of Dallas like a rocket, its engine roaring as Special Agent Roy Kellerman barked urgent directions to the driver. In the back seat, Jackie Kennedy cradled her husband's bloodied head in her lap, her pink suit now stained crimson. She whispered desperately to him, though his eyes stared blankly at the Texas sky above. Governor Connally groaned in pain beside them, his own wounds bleeding freely as his wife Nellie held him tight. Agent Clint Hill clung to the back of the speeding car, his body pressed against the trunk as the wind whipped around him. His face showed the grim determination of a man who had failed in his most important duty. The other Secret Service agents in the follow-up car radioed frantically to Parkland Hospital, their voices crackling with urgency over the static. They needed doctors ready immediately. They needed a trauma team standing by. Back in Dealey Plaza, witnesses stood in stunned silence or ran in panic. Some people still lay flat on the grass, where they had thrown themselves when the shots rang out. A few brave souls pointed toward the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, shouting about seeing a rifle barrel in the window. Police officers sprinted toward the building, their heavy footsteps echoing off the pavement. Abraham Zapruder clutched his camera with shaking hands, realizing he had captured something terrible on film. His face had gone white with shock. Around him, other spectators wept openly or stood frozen in disbelief. Children cried as their parents scooped them up and hurried away from the plaza. The festive mood of minutes before had vanished completely, replaced by fear and confusion. At Parkland Hospital, doctors and nurses rushed to prepare for the worst. Word had already reached them that the president had been shot. Emergency room staff cleared trauma bays and gathered blood supplies. Dr. Malcolm Perry and his team stood ready, their faces grim with the weight of what was coming. The limousine screeched to a halt at the hospital's emergency entrance. Agents and medical staff immediately surrounded the car. They lifted President Kennedy's limp body onto a stretcher, Jackie refusing to let go of his hand. Her face showed a mixture of hope and terror as they wheeled him through the doors. Governor Connally was rushed to another trauma room, conscious but badly wounded. Inside the hospital, controlled chaos replaced the wild panic of the plaza. Doctors worked with professional urgency while Secret Service agents secured the building. Phone calls went out to Washington, carrying news that would soon shake the world. The bright November day had become the darkest moment in American history, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something that would change everything forever. Part 4: President Kennedy's Death. At 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, Dr. Kemp Clark stepped out of Trauma Room 1 at Parkland Hospital. His face carried the weight of the words he was about to speak. The young president who had entered the hospital 30 minutes earlier was gone. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, was dead. Inside the trauma room, Jackie Kennedy stood beside her husband's body, still wearing the pink suit now stained with his blood. When someone suggested she change clothes, she refused with quiet determination. "Let them see what they have done," she said. Her words would echo through history, capturing the raw grief of a nation in that simple, powerful statement. The medical team had fought desperately to save Kennedy's life. Dr. Malcolm Perry and Dr. Clark had performed emergency procedures, but the massive head wound made survival impossible. The bullets had done too much damage. As the doctors officially recorded the time of death, nurses quietly stepped back, their professional composure barely containing their emotion. Word spread through the hospital like wildfire. Secret Service agents, their faces grim, secured phone lines to Washington. The news traveled in whispers at first, then in urgent calls that would soon reach every corner of America. In the waiting areas, reporters began receiving fragments of information that painted an increasingly dire picture. Walter Cronkite sat before the CBS camera in New York, his usual composure cracking as he removed his glasses to announce the president's death. His voice broke slightly as he delivered the words that would shatter millions of hearts across the country. Television screens in homes, offices, and public spaces became focal points for collective grief as Americans absorbed the impossible news. The impact was immediate and profound. In schools, teachers stopped their lessons to turn on radios. Students watched in confusion as adults around them began to cry. Factory workers gathered around transistor radios, their faces showing disbelief. The stock market plunged as traders struggled to process what had happened to their young, vigorous president. Around the world, the reaction was equally swift. In London, Moscow, and Paris, government officials rushed to assess what Kennedy's death might mean for international relations. The Cold War had suddenly lost one of its key players, a leader who had navigated the Cuban Missile Crisis just 1 year earlier. Back at Parkland Hospital, the reality of succession began to take shape. Vice President Lyndon Johnson, who had been unharmed in the attack, now faced the massive responsibility of leading a traumatized nation. The constitutional machinery of American government, designed for exactly such moments, began to move with solemn efficiency. The death of John F. Kennedy marked more than the loss of a president. It ended an era of optimism and youth that had characterized the early 1960s. As news of his death spread across America, it became clear that the country would need to find strength in its institutions and its people to move forward from this darkest of days. Part 5. Vice President Johnson swearing in. The weight of the presidency fell upon Lyndon Johnson's shoulders in the most tragic way imaginable. Within hours of Kennedy's death, constitutional duty demanded immediate action. The country needed a president, and it needed one now. Johnson, though shaken by the day's events, understood the critical importance of showing the world that American government would continue without interruption. Air Force One sat on the tarmac at Love Field, ready to carry the fallen president's body back to Washington. But before the plane could depart, history demanded a solemn ceremony. Federal Judge Sarah Hughes, a family friend of Johnson's, rushed to the airport to administer the oath of office. The cramped presidential cabin became an impromptu courtroom where the transfer of power would take place. 27 people crowded into the small space aboard the aircraft. Jackie Kennedy, still wearing her blood-stained pink suit, stood silently beside Johnson as he prepared to take the oath. Her presence carried profound meaning. The grieving widow's participation in the ceremony showed the nation that even in her darkest hour, she supported the peaceful transition that democracy required. Johnson placed his left hand on Kennedy's personal prayer book, found in his desk aboard the plane. The leather-bound volume had traveled with the president on countless journeys. Now it would witness the most important oath of Johnson's life. Judge Hughes spoke the familiar words, her voice steady, despite the extraordinary circumstances surrounding them. The oath took just 28 seconds to complete. Johnson raised his right hand and repeated the ancient words that every president before him had spoken. His voice was firm, though those present could see the gravity of the moment etched on his face. When he finished, he became the 36th President of the United States. Photographers captured the historic moment, creating an image that would define this dark chapter in American history. The cramped quarters, the mix of grief and duty on every face, and Jackie's haunting presence told the story of a nation in crisis finding strength in its institutions. Johnson's first words as president were brief but powerful. He asked for the prayers and help of all Americans. He promised to do his best to lead the country through this terrible time. The new president understood that his every action would be watched by a grieving nation and a worried world. Air Force One finally lifted off from Dallas, carrying both a martyred president and his successor back to Washington. The flight represented more than a journey home. It marked the beginning of Johnson's presidency and America's attempt to heal from the wounds of November 22, 1963. The constitutional system had worked as designed, ensuring that government would continue even in the face of unthinkable tragedy. Chapter 3: The Manhunt and Arrest, Part 1. Oswald flees and fires again. At exactly 12:33 p.m., just 3 minutes after the shots rang out in Dealey Plaza, Lee Harvey Oswald walked calmly through the second floor of the Texas School Book Depository. When police officer Marion Baker and building superintendent Roy Truly rushed up the stairs, they found Oswald standing near a Coca-Cola machine, appearing completely composed. Baker almost questioned him, but Truly vouched for Oswald as an employee, and they moved on to search higher floors. This brief encounter would later become one of the most scrutinized moments in American criminal history. Oswald's apparent calm suggested either complete innocence or remarkable self-control under extreme pressure. Within minutes of this exchange, Oswald left the building through the front entrance. No one stopped him. No one suspected him. He simply walked away from what would become the most infamous crime scene of the 20th century. Oswald moved quickly, but deliberately, through the Dallas streets. He caught a city bus, but traffic had slowed to a crawl as news of the shooting spread and crowds gathered. Growing impatient, he got off the bus and hailed a taxi. The cab driver, William Whaley, later remembered his passenger seemed agitated and kept looking over his shoulder. Oswald asked to be dropped off several blocks past his actual destination, a strange request that suggested he was trying to confuse his trail. At his boarding house on North Beckley Avenue, Oswald's landlady noticed him acting unusually hurried. He went to his room for just a few minutes, likely to retrieve his revolver, then left without explanation. His behavior struck her as odd enough that she would remember it clearly when police questioned her hours later. Around 1:15 p.m., about 45 minutes after the assassination, Officer J.D. Tippit was patrolling the Oak Cliff neighborhood when he spotted a man walking alone on East 10th Street. The description matched the suspect bulletin that had just been broadcast. Tippit pulled over and called out to the pedestrian through his car window. The man approached the patrol car, and they spoke briefly through the passenger side window. What happened next shattered any remaining hope that this was a simple case of mistaken identity. As Officer Tippit stepped out of his car, the man pulled out a revolver and fired 4 shots. Tippit collapsed on the street, dying instantly. Several witnesses watched in horror as the gunman calmly walked away, reloading his weapon. This second shooting transformed everything. The killing of President Kennedy might have been the work of a lone madman or part of a larger conspiracy, but the cold-blooded murder of a police officer revealed a calculated killer who would eliminate anyone threatening his escape. The stakes had risen dramatically, and the manhunt intensified with deadly urgency. Part 2. Capture and Detainment. The killer's trail led straight into a movie theater on Jefferson Boulevard. Just 40 minutes after Officer Tippett's murder, police surrounded the Texas theater where several witnesses had seen a suspicious man slip inside without paying. The afternoon screening was nearly empty, making it easy to spot the lone figure sitting in the back rows. Detective Paul Bentley entered through the front, while other officers covered the exits. The house lights came up suddenly, casting harsh shadows across the startled faces of the few moviegoers. In the back corner sat a young man with dark hair, wearing a brown shirt. He looked nervous, his eyes darting toward the emergency exits. "This is him," whispered one witness, pointing directly at Lee Harvey Oswald. As Detective Bentley approached, Oswald stood abruptly and raised his hands. But instead of surrendering, he swung his fist at the officer's face and reached for his revolver. "This is it," he shouted, struggling violently as more policemen rushed down the aisle. The scuffle was brief but intense. Officers grabbed his arms and wrestled the gun away before he could fire another shot. Within minutes, police cars surrounded the theater. Crowds gathered on the sidewalk as word spread through the neighborhood. Someone had been arrested for the president's murder. The man they dragged out in handcuffs looked ordinary, almost fragile. People strained to get a closer look at this person who had changed American history forever. At Dallas Police Headquarters, Captain Will Fritz began the first interrogation. Oswald sat across a small table, still wearing his rumpled brown shirt. He denied everything with cold defiance. No, he had not killed President Kennedy. No, he had not shot Officer Tippett. He claimed he was just a patsy, set up by others. But the evidence told a different story. The rifle found on the 6th floor of the book depository belonged to him. His palm print was on the weapon. Witnesses had seen him leaving the building right after the shooting. His landlady confirmed he had rushed home to change clothes and grab his revolver. The arrest brought both relief and confusion to a traumatized nation. Television networks interrupted regular programming to announce that police had captured a suspect. Americans gathered around their sets, desperate for answers. Who was this Lee Harvey Oswald? Why had he killed their beloved president? Yet something felt incomplete. This scrawny former Marine seemed too small, too ordinary to have single-handedly destroyed Camelot. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Was he working alone, or part of something larger? The capture had ended the manhunt, but it marked the beginning of an even more troubling mystery that would haunt America for generations to come. Part 3. The Murder of Oswald. The nation held its breath as Lee Harvey Oswald sat in the Dallas Police Department, surrounded by reporters and lawmen. For 2 days, he had denied everything. "I'm just a patsy," he insisted, his thin voice cutting through the chaos of questions. Television cameras captured his every word, his every gesture. America watched, searching his face for answers that never came. On Sunday morning, November 24th, Dallas police prepared to transfer Oswald to the county jail. The plan seemed simple enough. They would walk him through the basement of the police building to an armored car waiting outside. Reporters crowded the narrow corridor, their cameras ready to record this final chapter of the manhunt. At 11:21 a.m., Detective Jim Lavelle stepped forward, handcuffed to Oswald. The prisoner wore a dark sweater, his expression calm but alert. Behind them walked other officers, their eyes scanning the crowd of newsmen. Everything appeared routine until a stocky man in a dark suit pushed through the reporters. Jack Ruby owned a small nightclub in Dallas. He knew many of the police officers by name. For 2 days, he had watched the coverage obsessively, tears streaming down his face as he saw Jackie Kennedy's blood-stained dress. The grief had consumed him, mixed with rage at the man who had destroyed everything beautiful about that November weekend. Ruby stepped forward with surprising speed. His .38 revolver appeared from beneath his jacket. "You killed the president, you rat," he shouted. The shot rang out before anyone could react. Oswald doubled over, clutching his stomach, his mouth opening in a silent gasp of pain and shock. Chaos erupted in the basement. Officers tackled Ruby to the ground as cameras kept rolling. Millions of Americans watched live as Oswald collapsed, his body convulsing on the concrete floor. The prisoner who might have answered their questions was dying before their eyes. Within minutes, an ambulance rushed Oswald to Parkland Hospital, the same place where President Kennedy had died 2 days earlier. But this time, there would be no miracles. At 1:07 p.m., doctors pronounced Lee Harvey Oswald dead. The only man who truly knew what happened in Dealey Plaza would never speak again. The killing stunned a nation already reeling from tragedy. Ruby's impulsive act had silenced the one person who could explain everything. Was this justice? Or had Ruby eliminated the key witness to protect something darker? The questions multiplied like ripples in a pond, spreading outward into conspiracy theories that would persist for decades. Jack Ruby claimed he acted alone. Driven by grief and patriotism, he wanted to spare Jackie Kennedy the pain of a trial. But his background raised suspicions. His connections to organized crime, his financial troubles, his presence at the police station that morning. Nothing felt coincidental anymore. The investigation that should have provided closure instead opened new wounds. With Oswald dead, Americans faced an uncomfortable truth. They might never know the whole story. The assassination had become something larger and more frightening than one man's crime. It had become a mystery that would challenge their faith in official explanations and simple answers. Part 4. Controversy and Confusion. The death of Lee Harvey Oswald created a vacuum that doubt and confusion rushed to fill. Within hours of Ruby's shooting, questions that should have found answers in a courtroom began multiplying in the minds of Americans watching their televisions. The man who could have explained everything was gone, leaving behind only fragments of a story that didn't quite fit together. Police headquarters in Dallas became a scene of barely controlled chaos. Officers who had been preparing for what they thought would be the trial of the century now found themselves with a dead suspect and a mountain of unanswered questions. Detective Captain Will Fritz, who had spent 2 days questioning Oswald, stared at interrogation notes that would never be completed. The careful police work of building a case had been shattered by a single gunshot from Jack Ruby's revolver. The press, which had been covering what seemed like a straightforward murder case, suddenly faced something far more complex. Reporters who had interviewed Oswald just days before now scrambled to make sense of his death. Walter Cronkite, still processing the weekend's events on air, struggled to explain to viewers how the accused assassin had been killed while in police custody. The questions came faster than anyone could answer them. In Washington, officials who had hoped Oswald's capture would provide closure instead found themselves dealing with new problems. The FBI, already under pressure to explain how the president's security had failed so completely, now had to investigate not just one shooting, but 2. James, Edgar Hoover's agents began reviewing everything they thought they knew about both Oswald and Ruby, searching for connections they might have missed. Ordinary Americans, still reeling from Kennedy's death, watched the news with growing bewilderment. How had Ruby gotten so close to Oswald? Why had security been so poor? The simple story of a lone gunman killing the president had become something much more complicated and frightening. Phone calls between neighbors and family members carried new theories and fresh doubts with each conversation. The atmosphere of suspicion began to spread beyond Dallas. In coffee shops and offices across the country, people wondered aloud whether they were being told the whole truth. Some remembered Ruby's connections to nightclub owners and organized crime figures. Others questioned how a disturbed young man like Oswald could have planned such a precise attack alone. The official version of events, which had seemed solid just days before, now felt fragile and incomplete. Government officials realized they faced a crisis of public confidence that went far deeper than grief over Kennedy's death. Americans were beginning to doubt whether their institutions could protect them or even tell them the truth. The assassination had wounded more than just one man. It had damaged the nation's faith in its own government's ability to provide honest answers to the most important questions. Part 5. Funeral and National Mourning. The nation's capital transformed into a stage for collective sorrow as Kennedy's body arrived at the White House on Saturday morning. Jackie Kennedy, still wearing her blood-stained pink suit from Dallas, walked beside the casket with quiet dignity that captured the world's attention. Her refusal to change clothes sent a powerful message about the raw reality of what had happened. Throughout the weekend, an endless stream of mourners gathered outside the White House gates. Families drove for hours from neighboring states, bringing their children to witness history. Many clutched handmade signs and flowers, their faces showing the same bewildered grief that had settled over the entire country. The sight of ordinary Americans standing in long lines, waiting patiently to pay their respects, revealed how deeply the assassination had touched every corner of society. Inside the East Room, Kennedy's casket lay in state, surrounded by honor guards who stood motionless for hours. The formal ceremony contrasted sharply with the chaos of the previous days. Here, in this solemn setting, the magnitude of the loss became real for many Americans watching on television. The silence felt heavy with unspoken questions about what would happen next. Jackie Kennedy's decision to model the funeral after Lincoln's ceremony connected this tragedy to another moment when the nation had lost its leader to an assassin's bullet. The historical parallel offered some comfort, suggesting that America could survive this blow as it had survived others. Yet the comparison also highlighted how vulnerable democracy remained to sudden violence. The funeral procession on Monday morning drew leaders from around the world. Presidents, prime ministers, and royalty walked together through Washington streets, showing respect for both Kennedy and the American people. Their presence demonstrated that this loss extended far beyond national borders. The young president had represented hope and progress to people everywhere. Black Jack, the riderless horse with boots turned backward in the stirrups, became one of the most memorable images of the day. This ancient military tradition symbolized a fallen leader. And the sight moved viewers to tears. The horse seemed to carry the weight of national grief as it followed Kennedy's casket to Arlington Cemetery. At the graveside, the eternal flames sparked to life as Jackie Kennedy lit it with her own hand. This simple act created a permanent memorial that would burn long after the crowds dispersed. The flame represented continuity amid tragedy, hope despite despair, and the ongoing spirit of the man who had asked Americans what they could do for their country. The funeral's end marked the beginning of a long process of national healing. Americans had come together in their grief, finding strength in shared sorrow and collective memory. Yet questions about the assassination would linger for decades, ensuring that the events in Dallas would remain a defining moment in American history. Chapter 4. Investigation and Official Findings. The Warren Commission established. President Lyndon Johnson stood in the White House just 7 days after the assassination, facing a nation torn apart by grief and confusion. Wild rumors spread like wildfire through American streets. Some blamed the Soviets. Others pointed fingers at Cuba or the mafia. The new president knew he had to act fast before conspiracy theories destroyed public trust completely. Johnson picked up the phone and called Chief Justice Earl Warren. The conversation was brief but urgent. Warren initially refused the assignment, saying Supreme Court justices shouldn't lead executive investigations. But Johnson pressed hard, appealing to Warren's patriotism. "Your country needs you," Johnson insisted. He painted a dark picture of what might happen if the truth remained buried. Warren finally agreed, though reluctantly. On November 29, 1963, Johnson signed Executive Order 1130, creating the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy. The public would simply call it the Warren Commission. Johnson handpicked 6 other distinguished Americans to serve alongside Warren. Senators Richard Russell and John Cooper brought congressional experience. Representatives Hale Boggs and Gerald Ford represented the House. Former CIA Director Alan Dulles added intelligence expertise. Banker John McCloy rounded out the group. The commission received a sweeping mandate that seemed almost impossible to fulfill. They had to investigate every aspect of Kennedy's death. They needed to examine Lee Harvey Oswald's background completely. They had to determine if any conspiracy existed. Most importantly, they had to restore American confidence in their government. Warren faced immediate Part 2, Key Evidence and the Single Bullet Theory. The Warren Commission faced a mountain of physical evidence, but none proved more crucial or controversial than what they found in the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. 3 spent cartridge cases lay scattered near the southeast corner window. A 6.5mm Mannlicher Carcano rifle, later traced to Lee Harvey Oswald through mail-order records, was discovered hidden between book cartons on the same floor. But the most haunting piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Abraham Zapruder, a Dallas dress manufacturer, had captured the entire assassination on his 8mm home movie camera. Frame by frame, his 26-second film showed the presidential limousine moving down Elm Street. At frame 313, viewers could see the president's head snap backward as the fatal bullet struck. The film became both the most important evidence and the source of endless debate. The commission's ballistics experts faced a puzzle. President Kennedy suffered 2 wounds, one in his back and throat, another fatal shot to his head. Texas Governor John Connally, sitting in front of Kennedy, was also wounded in his back, chest, wrist, and thigh. Yet witnesses reported hearing only 3 shots, and investigators found evidence of just 3 bullets fired from Oswald's rifle. This led to what critics would later call the single bullet theory. Commission investigators concluded that 1 bullet had caused multiple wounds in both men. According to their reconstruction, the second shot entered Kennedy's back, exited through his throat, then struck Governor Connally, causing all his injuries before ending up on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital. The theory required precise timing and trajectory calculations. Using the Zapruder film as a timeline, experts determined the bullet's path through both men. They conducted tests using similar ammunition and created detailed anatomical drawings showing how one projectile could cause such extensive damage. Many found this explanation difficult to accept. The recovered bullet, labeled Commission Exhibit 399, appeared remarkably intact, despite allegedly passing through multiple bones and tissues. Critics dubbed it the magic bullet, arguing it was impossible for one projectile to cause such damage while remaining in near-perfect condition. Commission staff performed extensive ballistics tests to support their theory. They fired similar bullets through blocks of gelatin, goat carcasses, and human cadaver wrists. The results showed that Mannlicher Carcano bullets could indeed retain their shape after passing through soft tissue and even bones, depending on the angle and velocity. Yet doubts persisted among both experts and the public. Some commission members themselves expressed private reservations about the single bullet theory, though they ultimately endorsed it as the most logical explanation given the available evidence. The Zapruder film continued to fuel controversy. Different analysts saw different things in its frames. Some claimed it showed Kennedy's head moving backward, suggesting a shot from the front rather than Oswald's position behind the motorcade. Others pointed to specific frames showing Governor Connally's delayed reaction, questioning whether both men were struck simultaneously. These forensic debates would define how Americans viewed the assassination for generations, transforming technical evidence into the foundation for countless conspiracy theories and alternative explanations. Part 3. Commission Conclusions. The Warren Commission reached its final verdict on September 24, 1964, after 10 months of intensive investigation. Chief Justice Earl Warren presented the 888-page report to President Johnson with a clear and definitive conclusion. Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone when he killed President Kennedy. The commission found no credible evidence of a conspiracy, either domestic or international. The 7-member panel examined over 3,100 exhibits and heard testimony from 552 witnesses. They concluded that Oswald fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. 2 bullets struck their target. The first passed through Kennedy's neck and continued into Governor Connolly's back, chest, wrist, and thigh. The second bullet delivered the fatal headshot that killed the president instantly. Commission members spent considerable time exploring Oswald's background and possible motives. They painted a picture of a troubled loner with Marxist sympathies who had defected to the Soviet Union before returning to America. The report described Oswald as mentally unstable, prone to violence, and seeking notoriety through a dramatic act. His failed marriage, job troubles, and political frustrations created a volatile combination that led to November 22nd. The commission systematically dismissed various conspiracy theories that had already begun circulating. They found no evidence linking Oswald to foreign governments, organized crime, or right-wing extremists. Jack Ruby's killing of Oswald was portrayed as an impulsive act by a grief-stricken nightclub owner, not part of any broader plot to silence a patsy. Warren and his colleagues believed their thorough investigation would finally put the matter to rest. They hoped their detailed findings would restore public confidence in government institutions and provide the closure Americans desperately needed. The commission presented its work as the definitive account of what happened in Dallas, leaving no reasonable doubt about the basic facts. However, the report's certainty masked ongoing internal disagreements among commission members. Several had privately questioned aspects of the single-bullet theory, even while publicly endorsing it. These doubts never made it into the final document, which presented a unified front of absolute conviction. The commission's approach reflected the political climate of 1964. Cold War tensions made any suggestion of foreign involvement potentially explosive. Domestic conspiracy theories could have undermined faith in American institutions at a critical moment. The report offered Americans a simple explanation. One disturbed individual had changed history through a senseless act of violence. Yet even as Warren handed over the final report, signs of public skepticism were already emerging. Polls showed significant numbers of Americans remained unconvinced by the official story. Critics pointed to inconsistencies in witness testimony and questioned whether the commission had been too eager to reach neat conclusions. The very certainty that the commission hoped would end debate instead became a lightning rod for those who sensed something was being hidden from view. Part 4. Public Skepticism and Opposition. The Warren Commission's report landed in bookstores across America with a thud that echoed far beyond its 888 pages. Within weeks of its September 1964 release, opinion polls revealed a troubling reality for government officials who had hoped the investigation would settle all questions. Nearly half of all Americans refused to accept that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone. The doubts ran deeper than simple disbelief. Citizens who had lived through the shock of Dallas found themselves questioning not just the commission's conclusions, but the very institutions they had trusted for generations. Letters poured into newspaper offices from ordinary Americans who pointed to what they saw as glaring holes in the official story. How could 3 shots from a bolt-action rifle create so much damage in such a short time? Why did key witnesses describe hearing shots from different directions? Mark Lane, a New York lawyer, became one of the first prominent voices to challenge the commission directly. His 1966 book, Rush to Judgment, sold over 1 million copies, presenting testimony from witnesses whose accounts seemed to contradict the official findings. Lane argued that the commission had ignored evidence that didn't fit its predetermined conclusion. His public lectures drew packed audiences hungry for alternative explanations. The timing couldn't have been worse for government credibility. As questions about the assassination multiplied, American involvement in Vietnam was escalating. The same officials asking citizens to trust their judgment about foreign policy were now defending an investigation that many found unconvincing. This created a dangerous cycle where skepticism about one government action fed doubts about others. Critics focused their attacks on specific weaknesses in the Commission's work. They noted that key pieces of evidence, including Kennedy's brain, had mysteriously disappeared from the National Archives. They questioned why the Commission had relied so heavily on FBI reports instead of conducting independent investigations. Most damaging of all, they highlighted the Commission's failure to seriously examine possible connections between Oswald and intelligence agencies. The media, initially supportive of the Commission's work, began publishing articles that raised troubling questions. Life magazine, which had purchased the famous Zapruder film, published frame-by-frame analysis that seemed to support critics' claims about the timing and direction of shots. Television documentaries presented alternative theories to millions of viewers. This growing skepticism created lasting changes in how Americans viewed their government. The confident trust that had defined the post-war era began cracking under the weight of unanswered questions. Citizens demanded greater transparency and accountability from their leaders. The assassination investigation had intended to restore faith in American institutions, but instead became a symbol of their potential unreliability. The debate showed no signs of ending as the decade progressed, setting the stage for decades of continued investigation and speculation. Part 5. The Legacy of the Investigation. The Warren Commission's report became far more than a government document. It transformed into a defining moment that changed how Americans related to their leaders and institutions. The Commission had hoped to close the book on Dallas, but instead opened a new chapter in the relationship between citizens and their government. The official findings created an immediate split in American society. Government officials and mainstream media largely accepted the lone gunman conclusion, treating it as settled fact. They urged the nation to move forward and heal from the trauma. But millions of ordinary Americans refused to accept this version of events. They saw gaps in the evidence and inconsistencies in the testimony that demanded answers. This division had profound consequences for how the government operated. Intelligence agencies like the FBI and CIA faced new scrutiny about their methods and secrecy. Congress began demanding more oversight of these shadowy organizations. The comfortable arrangement where agencies operated with minimal public accountability started breaking down. Citizens wanted to know what their government was doing in their name. The Commission's work also changed journalism forever. Reporters became more skeptical of official statements and government claims. The old tradition of simply reporting what authorities said gave way to investigative reporting that questioned and verified. News organizations hired teams of researchers to examine government actions more closely. This shift created a more adversarial relationship between the press and those in power. Future investigations felt the weight of the Warren Commission's legacy. When the House Select Committee on Assassinations reopened the case in the 1970s, they worked under intense public scrutiny. Every decision was analyzed for signs of cover-up or manipulation. The committee ultimately reached different conclusions, finding evidence of a probable conspiracy, which only deepened public confusion about what really happened in Dallas. The broader impact extended to how Americans viewed historical events. People began questioning other official stories about major incidents. The Vietnam War, Watergate, and other controversies were examined through the lens of skepticism that the Kennedy assassination had created. The assumption that government officials told the truth disappeared for many citizens. Educational institutions also felt this change. History textbooks began including discussions about conflicting interpretations of events. Students learned to ask critical questions about sources and evidence. The idea that there might be one true version of history gave way to understanding that different perspectives could coexist. The Warren Commission's greatest legacy might be the permanent change it brought to American democracy. The era of trusting government statements without question ended in Dallas. In its place came a more demanding citizenry that expected transparency and accountability. This transformation, while sometimes creating chaos and confusion, ultimately strengthened democratic institutions by making them more responsive to public concerns. The assassination investigation had failed to restore simple faith in government, but it succeeded in creating a more engaged and watchful public that would reshape American politics for generations to come. Chapter 5: The Aftermath and Enduring Legacy, Part 1: Political Consequences. Lyndon Johnson stepped into the presidency carrying more than just the weight of unexpected leadership. He inherited a nation stunned by violence and a world watching America's response. The political earthquake that began in Dallas would reshape everything from foreign policy to civil rights for decades to come. The Cold War calculations changed overnight. Soviet leaders, initially suspected of involvement, now faced an unpredictable new president. Johnson had to prove America remained stable and strong, while grieving leaders wondered if their nuclear-armed rival might become more aggressive or more cautious. The delicate balance of superpower relations suddenly rested on a man most foreign capitals barely knew. Johnson understood that governing required more than sympathy. Within days, he began pushing Kennedy's stalled legislative agenda with fierce determination. The Civil Rights Act, which had languished in Congress despite Kennedy's support, became Johnson's immediate priority. He told congressional leaders that passing the bill would honor Kennedy's memory. The assassination had created political space that Johnson filled with extraordinary skill. The civil rights movement found itself in a complex new reality. Kennedy had been a reluctant ally who grew more committed over time. Now they faced Johnson, a Southerner whose voting record on race was mixed, but whose presidential ambitions were clear. Movement leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. quickly realized they must work with this new president who possessed both the will and congressional expertise Kennedy had lacked. Johnson's mastery of Senate politics proved crucial. He twisted arms, made deals, and used Kennedy's martyrdom as leverage. The Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, followed by the Voting Rights Act in 1965. These achievements exceeded what Kennedy might have accomplished alive, though the political costs would haunt Democrats for generations. The assassination also changed how Americans viewed their government. The idea that a lone gunman could alter history so dramatically shook confidence in institutions. Conspiracy theories began immediately, suggesting powerful forces had eliminated Kennedy. This suspicion would grow over time, contributing to the credibility gap that plagued subsequent administrations. Foreign policy took new directions under Johnson. While Kennedy had been cautious about Vietnam, Johnson felt pressure to appear strong. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964 led to massive escalation. Some historians argue Kennedy would have avoided this trap. But Johnson, haunted by accusations of weakness, committed America to a war that would define his presidency. The sense of lost potential became Kennedy's most enduring political legacy. His youth, charisma, and promise of new frontiers created a mythology that no successor could match. This idealized memory influenced how Americans judged later presidents, creating impossible standards based more on imagination than achievement. The political landscape had permanently shifted. The assassination marked the end of an era of relative innocence and the beginning of a more cynical age where Americans questioned official narratives and wondered what might have been. Part 2: Cultural Shock and National Trauma. Within hours of the shooting, something unprecedented happened in American homes. Television screens across the nation showed the same horrifying images again and again. Families gathered around their sets, watching Walter Cronkite remove his glasses and announce that the president was dead. His voice cracked with emotion, and suddenly, millions of Americans felt their world had changed forever. This was the first time a national tragedy unfolded live on television. Unlike previous disasters that people learned about through newspapers or radio, Kennedy's death became a shared, visual experience. Children came home from school to find their mothers crying at kitchen tables. Fathers sat silent in living rooms, unable to process what they had witnessed. The images burned themselves into collective memory. Jackie Kennedy in her pink suit, stained with blood. The president's body in the hospital. The flag-draped coffin. The funeral 4 days later transformed grief into ritual. Television cameras captured every moment as the horse-drawn caisson moved slowly through Washington streets. John Jr.'s small salute became an image that would define a generation's understanding of loss. The eternal flame at Arlington Cemetery flickered on screens in homes, where families wept together for a man many felt they knew personally. Television had created an illusion of intimacy with Kennedy. His press conferences, his smile, his young family had entered American homes regularly. When he died, it felt like losing someone close. This was different from mourning a distant leader. People grieved as if they had lost a friend, a brother, a symbol of their own hopes. The coverage continued for days. Normal programming disappeared. Instead, Americans watched endless tributes, interviews, and analysis. This constant exposure deepened the trauma. Every family had their own memory of where they were when they heard the news. These personal moments became woven into a national story of shared loss. The assassination marked the end of what many later called American innocence. Before Dallas, most citizens trusted their government and believed in steady progress toward a better future. Kennedy had embodied that optimism. His death suggested that violence could destroy the best intentions and brightest promises. The comfortable assumption that good things happen to good people crumbled in Dealey Plaza. Media coverage shaped not just immediate grief, but lasting memory. The repeated images, the solemn commentary, the endless speculation created a mythology around Kennedy's death. Television had not simply reported an event. It had created a cultural experience that would influence how Americans understood tragedy, leadership, and their own national character. This transformation reached far beyond politics into the very fabric of American identity. Trust in institutions began to erode, replaced by questions that would grow louder with each passing decade. Part 3. Conspiracy Theories and Mysteries. The questions that began forming in American minds after November 22, 1963, soon grew into something much larger than grief or confusion. Within months of the Warren Commission's conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, alternative explanations began emerging from every corner of society. These weren't just academic debates or political disagreements. They represented a fundamental crack in public trust that would never fully heal. The Warren Report itself created as many questions as it answered. Citizens noticed inconsistencies in witness testimony. They wondered about the magic bullet theory, which suggested a single shot caused multiple wounds in both Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally. Amateur investigators pored over the Zapruder film frame by frame. Convinced they saw evidence of shots from multiple directions, the backwards movement of Kennedy's head in the fatal moment seemed to contradict the official story of bullets fired from behind. By the late 1960s, District Attorney Jim Garrison in New Orleans was pursuing his own investigation, claiming to have found evidence of a conspiracy involving government agencies. His probe attracted massive media attention and introduced Americans to the possibility that their own institutions might have played a role in the president's death. The idea that the CIA, the FBI, or military intelligence could have orchestrated Kennedy's murder seemed unthinkable to many, yet increasingly plausible to others. The theories multiplied and evolved. Some pointed to the mafia, angry about the Kennedy administration's crackdown on organized crime. Others suggested Cuban exiles, frustrated by Kennedy's handling of the Bay of Pigs invasion. Still others believed Lyndon Johnson himself had orchestrated the assassination to seize power. Each theory found dedicated followers who spent years collecting evidence, writing books, and building communities around their beliefs. What made these theories so persistent was not just their complexity, but their emotional appeal. They offered explanations for a tragedy that felt too random, too senseless to accept at face value. The idea that a lone gunman with personal grievances could change the course of history seemed inadequate to match the magnitude of what had been lost. A grand conspiracy, while disturbing, at least provided proportional cause for such enormous effect. Hollywood embraced these alternative narratives. Films like Oliver Stone's JFK brought conspiracy theories to mainstream audiences, presenting them with cinematic power that official reports could never match. Television documentaries endlessly re-examined the evidence, keeping questions alive for new generations. Each new piece of released evidence, whether it supported or contradicted conspiracy theories, only seemed to fuel more speculation. The persistence of these theories revealed something profound about American culture in the decades following Dallas. They became a way for citizens to express broader doubts about government honesty, institutional competence, and official explanations of complex events. The assassination had shattered more than just one presidency. It had broken a basic assumption about truth and authority that would never be completely restored. Part 4. Historical Impact and Revisions. The persistence of questions about Dallas created something unprecedented in American history. A criminal case that would never truly close. As decades passed, new investigations emerged with fresh eyes and different methods. The House Select Committee on Assassinations reopened the case in 1976, bringing modern forensic techniques to evidence that had sat in archives for over a decade. Their acoustic analysis suggested a second gunman might have fired, contradicting the Warren Commission's lone shooter conclusion. This finding sent shockwaves through a nation that thought the matter was settled. Government secrecy became its own problem. Millions of documents remained classified, feeding speculation about what authorities were hiding. The John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992 forced the release of previously secret files, but each batch of documents seemed to raise as many questions as it answered. Researchers pored over FBI memos, CIA cables, and police reports, searching for clues that earlier investigators had missed or ignored. Medical experts re-examined the autopsy evidence with advanced technology. Computer models recreated bullet trajectories. Photography specialists analyzed film frames with digital precision impossible in 1963. Each new scientific approach promised definitive answers, yet somehow the mystery persisted. Different experts reached different conclusions from the same evidence, showing how complex and ambiguous the physical record remained. The Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 opened new archives in Moscow. Historians gained access to KGB files about Oswald's time in Russia, hoping to find smoking gun evidence of foreign involvement. Instead, they discovered a portrait of Oswald as an unstable young man whom Soviet intelligence found more troublesome than useful. Similar disappointments followed other promising leads. Academic historians approached the assassination with scholarly methods, treating it like any other historical event. They focused less on solving the crime and more on understanding its meaning. These scholars examined how the assassination reflected broader social tensions of the 1960s, how it changed American political culture, and why it continued to fascinate the public imagination. New witnesses occasionally emerged with previously untold stories. Deathbed confessions made headlines. Anonymous sources claimed insider knowledge. Each revelation went through intense scrutiny, with researchers checking claims against known facts and timelines. Most proved unreliable, but the constant stream of new information kept public interest alive. The Internet age transformed assassination research. Amateur investigators could access documents, share theories, and debate evidence online. This democratization of research brought fresh perspectives, but also spread misinformation faster than ever before. Professional historians found themselves competing with countless amateur theories for public attention. Today, the assassination remains a case study in how historical understanding evolves. New evidence continues to emerge, forcing scholars to revise earlier conclusions. The story demonstrates that some historical events resist simple explanations, remaining open to interpretation and debate. What seemed like a straightforward crime in 1963 had become a complex puzzle that revealed as much about America's relationship with truth as about the events in Dallas. Part 5. Remembering JFK. The search for answers about November 22, 1963, gave way to something equally powerful: the need to remember. In the weeks following Kennedy's death, America began the complex process of turning tragedy into memory, creating ways to honor both the man and the moment that changed everything. The first memorial appeared almost immediately. Jacqueline Kennedy insisted that the president's grave at Arlington National Cemetery feature an eternal flame, borrowed from the French memorial at the Arc de Triomphe. When she lit that flame on November 25, 1963, it became more than a tribute to her husband. It became a symbol of hope that refused to die, drawing millions of visitors who needed to witness something permanent in a world that suddenly felt fragile. Cities across America began renaming streets, schools, and airports in Kennedy's honor. New York's Idlewild Airport became John F. Kennedy International Airport within weeks of his death. The changes happened so quickly that they revealed how desperately the nation needed to hold on to something positive from the catastrophe. Each renamed street and dedicated building became a small act of defiance against the forces that had taken their president away. Artists and writers found their own ways to process the trauma. Norman Mailer wrote extensively about the assassination's impact on American consciousness. Bob Dylan's songs captured the confusion and anger many felt. Hollywood began producing films that reflected the nation's lost innocence, moving away from the optimistic stories of the 1950s toward darker, more complex narratives that questioned authority and simple answers. The annual November 22nd commemorations became rituals of national reflection. Television networks marked each anniversary with documentaries and special reports. The footage of that weekend in Dallas became as familiar to Americans as home movies, played and replayed until they formed a shared visual memory that connected generations. Libraries and schools created special collections dedicated to Kennedy's presidency and death. The 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository became a museum, transforming the site of tragedy into a place of learning and remembrance. Visitors could stand where Oswald had positioned himself and try to understand how history had pivoted in that single location. Kennedy's family worked carefully to shape his legacy. They emphasized his calls for public service, his vision of space exploration, and his commitment to civil rights. The phrase, "Ask not what your country can do for you," became more than a campaign slogan. It became a moral challenge that outlived the man who spoke it. The assassination taught Americans that their leaders were vulnerable and that their nation's story could change in an instant. But the memorials, the renamed streets, and the annual remembrances also taught them something else: that memory itself could be a form of resistance against chaos, a way of preserving the best parts of what was lost while learning from the worst parts of what happened.